Hey, good morning, all. It is Monday, April 20th. I'm actually going to break this video down into two parts. One of them is going to review lesson three that I gave you last Thursday. This had some excerpts from Frederick Douglass's autobiography. And then later on, click on part two, which will talk about lesson four, which leans a little bit more heavily on some visuals that I'd normally have a chance to show you in class and go over with you, but we're going to do that on our Chromebooks today. So anyway, lesson three, I gave you four excerpts from, as I talked about, Frederick Douglass's autobiography. Frederick Douglass, born in the early 1800s in Maryland as a slave, ended up escaping slavery, going from Baltimore to Philadelphia. So from a slave state of Maryland to a free state in Pennsylvania when he was 20 years old. And from there began a long career. He was an author. He was a publisher. He was kind of an advisor to President Lincoln. And I believe I included his image all the way down here. This is actually the autobiography that sits on the shelf in my classroom right now. All right, but anyway, going over the excerpts, I chose this one. I mean, it's in my opinion anyway. I hope yours as well. It's incredibly sad. Talking about how it was customary in that part of Maryland at the time to separate mothers from their children when born into slavery. And then just the description of how he knew his mother, right? Just a handful of times she would sneak off her plantation, which was 12 miles away at night. Obviously, couldn't do that during the day, but she'd also have to sneak back to her own plantation at night. So just for a few hours in the middle of the night, think about like 2, 3 a.m. She was able to lie next to her boy, her son. But it only happened a few times, and ultimately she passed away when Frederick Douglass was just 7 years old. I believe she died of tuberculosis. But just how heart-wrenching that is, like that, because of slavery, that's the relationship that this small boy had with his mother for no other reason. So very, very heartbreaking. With the second reading here, this one's just a little bit more matter of fact about how it is that food and clothing were distributed to slaves at this time. So again, we're talking the 1830s, 1840s. Talked about, their yearly clothing consisted of two coarse linen shirts, linen trousers, shirts, one jacket, one pair of stockings, one pair of shoes. So you see how meager these the portions are here. Speaking of, it talks also about how much food they were given, monthly allowance. So 8 ounces of pork. Well, think about it in a month, right? 8 ounces. A quarter pounder would be 4 ounces because there's 16 ounces in a pound. So not very much. I'm sorry, it says 8 pounds, but even still, right? 8 pounds spread out over a month is not very much. All right, I'll try to read a little bit better here. And then talking about what exactly their bedding situation is, not very desirable, obviously. The third one talked about what bothered Frederick most. So this is talking about how it wasn't so much the hunger, it was actually the cold. Perhaps sometimes when we think about slavery, we think about, the deep south of Mississippi and Alabama and the sweltering heat. When, of course, I'm sure that's very true. But, we're in North America, and there are very few places in the United States where in the deep parts of the winter, it doesn't get cold, especially when you think about where Maryland is, right? It's not that, Maryland is mostly north of Washington, D.C. So yes, it's in the South as far as slavery goes, but you're only talking about a 9.5 hour drive in a car from Epping, so it's really not that far away. So very cold, and what he complains about, and then talking about how the kids were fed with this cornmeal, sort of a cornmeal is kind of a grainy, sort of floury um, element, and it would be boiled and turned to mush, and to have these kids sit around and, as Frederick Douglass describes, almost like pigs eating from a trough, and they used oyster shells. Obviously, they wouldn't be given utensils, but they would take things from around to use as utensils. And then we get to the fourth one, which I thought was sort of an interesting um, change in somebody. So one of the reasons why Frederick Douglass became a writer and an editor and a publisher was because he knew how to read, which was very rare back then. In fact, it was actually, as it says here, it was unlawful for that to happen. But Frederick Douglass's master's wife, this Mrs. Auld, taught him his ABCs and was teaching him how to spell words. But once her husband caught wind of this, he put an end to it immediately. And it talks about how Frederick Douglass described a woman who, at the onset, was very kind to him, but her heart was basically sort of ruined and darkened by being a slave owner. And so, while I think Frederick Douglass sort of he talks about sort of owing a debt to her by being kind enough, at least originally, it's almost like she didn't know better. She didn't know that she was supposed to act a different way as a slave owner. So she ended up, what are some of the words here? A fatal poison, irresistible power. So it doesn't end well in Frederick Douglass's eyes for Mrs. Auld. All right. Well, like I said, stick around for part 2. That was just a review of lesson 3, and we're going to get into a slave rebellion and then some paintings that occurred during the abolitionist and slavery time.